Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to Searching the Sacred. Steph, Lisa, and Jason are here with you again, and we are in episode 7 of our 7-episode season 10 that we are looking at different garden or garden-ish imagery. Could be a vineyard, could be a field, could be a garden, and so we've been hanging out in the Old Testament for a while, and last time we moved into the New Testament, where we looked at what it means to be a mustard seed that becomes a surprising tree. So hopefully you tuned into that either on YouTube or on your podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. And so we are going to close up our series by talking about God as the gardener. And so Jesus has these passages throughout the book of John where he says, I am ... And in this one, he talks about being the gardener. And so we're going to kick it off with chapter 15 of the book of John. And I'm going to turn it over to Lisa.
Okay, I'm going to do verses 1 to 8 using the First Nations version, which is an indigenous translation of the New Testament. I am the true grapevine. My Father is the vine keeper. He cuts off the branches in me that have no fruit. He carefully trims back the branches with fruit so they will grow more fruit. My teachings have purified you, but you must stay joined to me in the same way a branch is joined to the vine. A branch cannot grow fruit unless it is joined to the vine. It is the same with you and me. I am the vine and you are the branches. The one who stays joined to me will grow much fruit, for without me nothing grows. The ones who do not stay joined to me are broken off and dry up, and they are gathered up and used to make a fire. If you are joined to me and my words remain in you, you can ask me for anything and it will be done. When you grow a harvest of fruit, this will show that you are walking my road. You will then bring great honor to my Father.
All right. I always like hearing that translation because it just shakes things up a little bit to hear it with different language. So I'm curious for each of us what we noticed, what stuck out, what questions we have.
This version felt a little pointed. Like I felt like I understood the story better than when I read it in other translations.
Yeah, usually this that's interesting. It felt like a more clear storytelling, and that's not always what happens with that translation.
No.
I felt like it was. I'm actually surprised to hear you both say that it was a little bit more pointed, because I felt it was a little bit more tender. Partly because I think coming from the tradition that I did, where there was this kind of like in and out mentality, and sometimes this verse was like either you bear fruit or you get thrown into the fire, and we all know what the fire is representative of. It's hell, and we don't want to go burn there forever. And just for the record, my parents never actually said that. It was just the videos that we watched in church. Anyway, so just want to clarify.
That's fair.
My parents would be appalled to hear that that's what we were watching, but we did. So, anyway, side moment over. Whereas this one, it just talked about like they will be cut off and they will be used to start a fire. And like, I just thought that was like, it wasn't redemptive, right? We're still burning up the branches that get cut off. Which, I mean, if we're talking about people getting cut off from God and burning up, that's still terrible. But like, it just felt like if we're talking about, like if I'm out in nature and I see a dead branch laying on the ground, like there's a usefulness still to it. Like I can use it and it can provide something for me. Now, I don't know if that's what we're going to like dive into, but that's where I felt there was a little bit more of a tenderness or a little bit more thought, just, I don't know, care. As opposed to just like discard, throw it in the fire that's already just endlessly burning, that's where you go. And it was like, no, we're just going to use this for something else. And that's okay. Maybe it's not okay, but like, at least it's, I don't know, just didn't sound as terrible.
Mm-hmm. And I was thinking, especially as you say that, it's interesting what we do with passages where the you is plural, in terms of how we then interpret things that are singular. So Like,
Okay, where? Yeah, tell us where you're seeing that, and we'll go.
yeah.
From
So it's talking about I am the vine, you are the branches in verse 5. So there's a plural you there. He's looking at his disciples, you are the branches. And then if someone doesn't abide in me, he's cast forth as a branch. Like, I'm curious, is it necessarily that I am a branch? Does the fact that we are the branches mean that I am a branch? Or does it mean we all are branches? So is it saying I get cast off into the fire, or is it saying a part of me gets cast off into the fire, or the part of me that needs to get burned away gets burned away? Because that really matters for what we do with what Jesus is saying here is if we are the branches, does that mean each of us is a singular branch, or are each of us a plurality of branches?
yeah. Wow. Okay.
Does that make sense as a question? Because I think that really matters for what we're talking about with something getting thrown, like pruned off. Are we pruning off people, or are we pruning off parts of any of us that need to get pruned?
So if we, yeah,
I feel like you almost have to go back up to 2 because, like,
yeah.
Jesus is referring to, like, himself, and any branch that is not, what does he say? That does not bear fruit gets taken away.
Mm-hmm.
So so the branches that don't have any fruit get taken off. The
Mm-hmm.
branches that are bearing fruit get
Remain.
pruned, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which means there's parts of them that may get removed in order to flourish even more. So I think the question we're asking is, are there fruit-bearing people and are there non-fruit-bearing people, individuals, and are those non-fruit-bearing individuals cast off? Or are
Well,
we
this is sort of
all?
reaction to the video that you watched, right? Is it a human
Yeah.
getting cast off into the fire, or how is that different from the parts that don't bear fruit getting burned?
Or, we also think of this as individualistic because we're an individualistic society as opposed to a collectivist society where we see things in community more. So when Jesus says in verse 5, I am the vine, you are the branches, and the you is plural, that could be because Jesus is speaking communally and saying, like, y'all are the branches. Like, and we're going to do some work with you. Some of you don't bear fruit. We're going to toss you out. Some of you, you're bearing fruit, and we're going to have to prune you still. I mean, I don't know. That's This is one of those passages where I think we can get really confused by what we've been taught and therefore what we bring to it. And also, this is one that can make us uncomfortable, and we want to try to explain why it shouldn't be uncomfortable.
Well, I also want to wonder about if we say for a moment it is a human who doesn't bear fruit is burned. Let's allow that to be the interpretation for a moment. How is that different from a human who doesn't believe in Jesus is burned? Because this is a very
different things, right?
Very specific thing, and how it's been used in those videos is, oh, you've got to believe in Jesus or you get thrown into the
prayer,
fire.
yeah.
And I would say there's a lot of people I can think of that I won't name names of because that would be rude and unfair, and I'm not God. But where I would look at them and I would say, you claim to believe in Jesus, but I do not see fruit.
Right.
And so there's a difference between faith and fruit, and this passage is talking about fruit.
Yeah. Yep.
What's the fruit?
Yeah. Well, and this is where, like, similar language in different places of the Bible gets a little confusing because do we stay in John, or do we, like, take into consideration what Paul does later on? Because Paul clearly has an idea of what Paul sees as fruit of the Spirit, right? We can get into love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. So we could say, like, oh, if you're exemplifying any of these things, then then you're good with what Jesus says in John 15, even though we're talking about two clearly different, writings, not even the same author, not even the same community, like very different concepts. Yet we like to bring them together. The other thing we do is we could say, well, yeah, in John 15 it says that we take off the branches that are dead, but also Paul writes about grafting branches back in, and like even the ones that have fallen away can be grafted back into the vine and made to flourish. And so maybe there's some hope here, like we can do all these kind of hermeneutical dances. But yeah, I think your question is really important, to stay with what Jesus is saying. Like, what does it mean for Jesus in this moment to be talking about fruit?
I'm looking for something in particular right now. So sorry. Yeah, okay, this is what I thought. There is a Greek something that we need to notice, I think, as we wrestle with that, which is that in chapter 15, verse 6, my translation says, if a man does not abide in me, he is cast forth as a branch. Does anyone's translation say something else besides that?
Whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers.
Okay, so yours says whoever. That's starting to get at this question of, I think the Greek here is probably important as we wrestle with what Jesus is and isn't saying, because the word is not anthropos. So in Greek, lots of times in John, if the emphasis is being a human, the word would be anthropos. That's like we can hear anthropomorphic, right? We use that word still. Anthropos is a noun that is a human being. The word in chapter 15, verse 6 is tis, which is some, certain, whom, whose, whosoever. It's a more vague word. It's not human necessarily. It can be, but it's otherwise translated as things like any, one, some, if. So I'm thinking about then my translation, if a man doesn't abide in me, he's cut off and thrown in the fire, feels very much like it's the human being thrown in the fire. That's the source of the videos that you were watching. Whereas if it's some that don't abide in me, they're cast forth as a branch and withered, and they're gathered and they're burned. Well, that goes back to the fact that it could be a part of me that doesn't abide is gathered and burned, because it's not saying the human is. Does that make sense? The choice of that particular word feels important, that it's not the word anthropos. It is not the word that is used to say human being. It is a more vague word.
So at this point in the passage, we've established that there's going to be some pruning that happens in order for fruit to flourish more. So could it be possible that instead of it being we're going to cut off a person, it's the parts of a person that need to be pruned are going to be cut off and then burned up, as opposed to the entire being, because we don't have that very clear anthropos word.
Oh, is it anthropos? Was I saying it wrong?
I have no idea. I was just trying to sound cool.
Yeah, I think you know Greek better than I do. So.
You always say that, Stephanie, and
well, you have a doctorate of ministry.
I have a doctorate of ministry. I have a master's of theology, and I got a C in Greek and had to petition the school to allow me to continue in the master's program because they changed the rules while I was there to change from having to get a B in all your core classes to having to keep a B average, which I did have. So I had a B average, even though I got a C in Greek, which basically means I was a graduate student who was barely average with the undergrads. So there you go.
I mean, to me, this feels really important to say, like, to notice how often it's translated as like certain ones. 104 times. It's more like the idea of certain ones. Or,
I don't feel like it's I'm just gonna say this. I don't feel like that I feel like we're still talking about people. I can't detach like, when I read the whole thing in context, I don't suddenly go, "Oh, we're just cutting off a part of something." I'm not quite there yet. I don't feel fully convinced that that's what's happening in the passage. I think
Okay, so let's do the thing that Stephanie normally does. Let's hold the tension that maybe we're just talking about pieces of things or a certain thing or a certain
essentially.
one or if or many or whatever. But then let's have the harder conversation, right? What if this is about removing people? Like, what is that all about?
I
Lisa,
feel
I
like
think Jason's asking you.
yeah, well, because 'cause I'm thinking about the whole narrative that we're kind of like we're in the like, we're talking about this pruning situation,
Yeah.
which I feel like is just it's, like, adjacent enough to enough church experiences that I've had of, like, hate the sin, love the sinner. Like, there's these weird things of, like, well, if that's not good enough, get rid of it. Uh, there's something about, like, this way that, I almost want it to be a whole person because I feel like we kinda there's I don't know if this is making sense. I just think I'm rubbing against some of the history of, um, conversations that just haven't gone well of 'cause, like, what fruit are we talking about? Like, we're talking about, like so we're in a vineyard, so we're clearly I mean, we're talking grapes, I'm guessing. And so when we say fruit and more grapes, more
Mhm.
clusters of grapes, I'm thinking, um, you know what didn't produce a lot of fruit? Is all the things they told me to cast off. I I mean, I grew up in a tradition that when talking about sexuality, if it was not heteronormative so, like, I
Mhm.
think that in some of that feels all of it feels a little bit adjacent to those things of, like, what are we talking about with fruit? What are we talking about with, like, humans? And it's not a super like, again, Jesus isn't it it's not super clear because 'cause we're in some sort of weird imagery that
Mhm.
I don't s I mean, I don't really talk about vineyards that much. I don't have one. I don't know much
Mhm.
about it.
Mhm.
Mhm. Well, and it also is interesting because we don't get an indication that so if this is going to be maybe drawing too many conclusions, but I think Paul does this later on, which again, I just said we shouldn't do this, but whatever. We're not talking about like apple trees, orange trees, vineyards, all being part of the same interconnective thing. We're talking about just the vineyard, which could be representative of people that are already part of the same thing, same community, same belief system, same like think of it like a church subcult, like your people, right? Some of y'all don't have fruit. That's a problem because you're running around representing like you're part of this. That's not good. Some of you are doing a great job and there's some areas that we need to do some work on so that you can continue to lean into what all the good that's going on. It's not saying, "Oh, those people out there are the problem because of this thing or that thing, and they're going to be cast out because they don't agree with us." No, it's about what's happening within our community, within our church, or within our secret handshake club of whatever.
I think that's a really important thing to like as we think about the baggage piece that you mentioned, um, Jason, is that nowhere here does it mention heaven or hell or eternity or in or out or like there's a bunch of things we can wonder about, we can wrestle with, but we might be assuming that a fire is some sort of eternal burned up something, but it's not clear. It could be, but it's not. This doesn't. The thrust of this isn't believe in me and go to heaven. Don't believe in me, get burned up in the fires of hell. So it's a conversation about fruit and what fruit you're part of. And I think it's probably helpful to talk about the fact that in Isaiah 5, verse 7, it says, the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel. And it talks about the fruit of Israel having gone bad as a part of why the exile is happening. And it says in verse 6, I will lay it waste, it shall not be pruned, because of what has happened. So there's a way that we can say, okay, if Jesus is saying he is the vine, but the imagery in the past has been that Israel is the vineyard, there's a huge backstory to this idea that Jesus declaring himself a vine is saying there's a different way to be in. And there's then a different way to bear fruit than being a promised land named Israel with God as the king, because I am saying I am the vine and God is the gardener, the vine dresser of that vine. You bear fruit through abiding in me. So there's a big theological shift there.
There's potentially a big geopolitical shift happening right there too, which we want to be kind of careful of, especially in our day and age.
I mean, Jesus,
I feel like too theologically, like this also feels like, so wait, other vines that God is the vine keeper of?
Are there other vines? Could be.
I mean,
because there's a way of saying then, like Jesus is looking at his disciples and saying, okay, you've been following me. Here's the next level of following me. Know that everything has shifted. What we're talking about is that I am the vine. You bear fruit through remaining in me and following what I do. If I then think about what it is to be connected to that vine, that means the fruit should match the vine. So when we're thinking about what the fruit looks like, there's a way of saying here, if you don't look like me, then you're not actually my disciple. Because that's part of the imagery of a vine too, right? If I am the vine and you are the branches of the vine and I am it's a vine, it's grapes. If your grapes don't look like my grapes, then you're not actually one of my disciples. You're not actually connected to me if you don't look like Jesus. And I think that's an interesting challenge for people who call themselves Christians, is to say, does my life look like Jesus? Or how often, to Lisa's point, am I looking at other people who aren't even trying to be a part of the vine and saying, oh, you don't look like Jesus? Well, they're not even like, what if this is insider baseball? If you want to be a disciple, this is what it should look like. There's a requirement to following me. Your life should look like mine.
And I think it's important, if you read like a few verses further in this conversation or this expository thing that Jesus is saying, is that the very next thing he talks about is abiding in him and abiding in God. And there's like a joy of having that abiding nature. Like, so you are in like a dynamic relationship. And then the very next thing after that is, I no longer, like, let's be really careful here. I don't consider you servants and I'm your master. I see you as a friend. Like, and so that's even shifting dynamics between how we see this, because this whole idea of like, I'm the vine and you are the branches can sound very authoritative and very like, get in line or else. Whereas like, I think Jesus uses that imagery to try to get people thinking differently about what it means to be a disciple. And then he very quickly says, okay, but it's not because I'm the master and you're the servant. I see you as a friend. Like, we're doing this in partnership. And now I know it's like hard to like grasp both those things at the same time, but I think Jesus is trying to say we can have two things at the same time.
that starts to connect to the whole of like the greater context, even than that, is that this is Jesus's words to his disciples before he's about to be killed. Like, what does he want them to remember
Mm-hmm.
about who he is and what it is to follow him? And so to say, he's framing up, I'm your, you know, I love you. There's a spirit that's going to be a part of this with you. Abide in me and you'll bear fruit. There's a way this actually could be seen. Like, I feel like we're reading it as like pressure, but it could be seen as like relief of like, you actually don't have to try hard to do this right. Just abide in me and you will
Mm-hmm.
naturally bear the fruit of being my disciple.
Mm-hmm.
Like, don't try. You don't have to try so hard. You don't have to do X, Y, and Z. Like, just abide in me and you will bear fruit and God will take care of the rest. Like,
Mm-hmm.
just be a part of this vine. Could feel really different in that context of like Jesus trying to bring, there's like a lot of things in the end of John in this upper room discourse where he's saying comforting words.
Mm-hmm.
So if this is meant to bring comfort, maybe it is actually meant to be more of the abide focus. Like, you worry about abiding in me and then you'll bear fruit. God will take care of the rest.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
Because I think that's a part of where we've done harm is like the emphasis here is that God is the vine dresser or the husbandman, which is a funny, that's a King James word, land worker, the farmer. It is God who is in charge of this vine, which means that humans have no part to play in casting anything out.
Mm-hmm.
The emphasis is whatever is happening with the pruning, that is God's to do. It is a human's job to abide in the vine. It is God's job to take care of the care of the vine.
Mm-hmm.
And so perhaps one of the damaging things that has been done is we've put ourselves in the role of knowing what in the world it means for God to be pruning that vine when the emphasis is you're not the pruner of the vine. So like trust that part to God.
Mm-hmm.
It's like there's a parable that we referenced I think last time of the wheat and the tares, where somebody has this wheat field and somebody sowed weeds amongst the wheat that is disturbing to the farmer, obviously, because now there's a bunch of weeds. And so the farmer like wants to pick the weeds. But the problem with that specific kind of weed is it looks just like a wheat until it bears fruit. And so the emphasis there is you have to just let it all grow. You are not in charge of pulling the weeds. And I wonder if there's a similar emphasis here. God is the gardener. You just worry about abiding and bearing fruit.
Mm.
Well, there's something also kind of interesting happening with the words of the translation. So in verse 2 and 3, so like in the, I don't know, King James, like the purgeth, that pruning is actually like that word, like kathairo is to cleanse. Like we're using it as purging, but it's also in that cleanse family,
Mm-hmm.
which is also then in 13, when you are clean through the word which I have spoken, is katharos, which is also clean. Like those words are related in their actions.
Mm.
So what I'm thinking about is that the the way that they are pruned is through the word which Jesus has spoken to the disciples. That's how they've been pruned or cleansed.
Mm-hmm.
Which feels very different than being like cut off and thrown in a fire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you know what I'm like? There's something in there, like whatever God's doing in the.
I'm really
As a
struck right
keeper.
now by. Sorry, what were you saying?
No, go ahead.
I'm distracted by like how many passages that actually say what God's role is and what our role is, do we end up getting distracted by the thing that God is doing and miss the thing that is ours to do? And in that actually show why it's not ours to do it. Like when we're reading ourselves as being a part of cutting people off, or like when we were there, it just felt so like, oh, that's violent, that's whatever. But like that, none of that's our job in the passage. It's God's job. And there's a way that when once we release, I don't know if this makes sense. We can start to see it differently. Like, oh, if God's purging, I don't know if I can't. It's not making sense outside of my head. I just think we do damage when we put the emphasis in the wrong spot, and we tend to put the emphasis in the wrong spot when we put ourselves in the wrong spot.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're doing, Lisa, by noticing that, like how Jesus says, you are clean through the words I've spoken to you, that puts us back in our proper place. And there's something that then releases the whole thing when we're back in our proper place. Sorry if that didn't make sense. I'll keep working on it.
No, this is a really interesting and helpful conversation about this passage, because what I hear you saying is we often put ourselves in the position of God to decide who is in and who is out, who gets pruned and what do we prune, when the job of being human is to abide in Christ, or abide in Jesus, abide in the vine, and and if we do that, we will naturally produce the fruit. I think the scary part is that if there is no discerning process that we're supposed to have, we have to have some understanding of what the fruit actually is, because there's a lot of people out there who talk about representing the will of God, or the values of God, because they're exclusionary and because they're moral, and they're holding a quote unquote moral line, and it's like their Christian duty to do so. And so there's a lot of people that would prop it up as like, look at the fruit of their life. They are standing up for this and this and this. And man, aren't they just so, they're just a warrior for Christ. And like, and it's like, am I not supposed to be like critical of that? Because I actually don't see that as fruit. I see that as actually the opposite of fruit.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't look anything like the Jesus that I see. And yet, am I supposed to just like how do I just let God do the work? Like, what does it mean? Because I mean, if I'm honest, it feels like a lot of the problem is that the Christian church has just decided for itself what it thinks God is all about, and it's just run roughshod over the entire name. I mean, how many of us like to admit we're Christian? Like, um, so I think that's just where it gets to be so tricky, like,
Mm-hmm.
because we've twisted what the fruit is, and we can't talk against it, or not. I'm not advocating for like, actually, I think we should go against this passage, and we should be cutting people off and but I don't, it's hard for me not
Well,
to name when a
I
thing looks
wonder.
bad, to say like, y'all, this isn't healthy. Because like,
Uh-huh.
I'll be honest, I have a small Methodist church, and I think, of course, I think this. I think we're doing things as humbly as we can. And when people come from a mega church and they walk in the doors and they say, we wanted to come to a place that was inclusive, that felt more like family and a place of belonging, there's a voice in the back of my head that says, be really careful, because you don't want to be a sheep stealer. You don't want to take from another church, because that's not how you want to market yourself. That's not how you want to do this. That's not what the kingdom is all about. You don't build your church by taking from other people's flock, or whatever, stupid imagery we have. But there's also a part of me, like the predominant part of me, that's like, but I don't see the fruit of what they're going to. And I damn well would rather have them be at my church, where I know what we're going to talk about is being humble and kind and serving and creating a place of belonging for, you know, kids who don't have heteronormative, you know, gender and all that. Like, and so am I sheep stealing? And should I just get so bound up in all that Christian bullshit that I end up, what does it mean to like live into like what I feel we're called to be, you know, like without trampling all over others, you know, because I don't want to be like divisive, but I also don't approve, I don't like, and I don't agree with what goes on, you know, with the way some churches talk about kids and they talk about families, they talk about, you
Well,
know, people
maybe
or
this is
minorities,
taking,
or it's just,
maybe that, maybe
anyway,
it's
struck a
allowing,
nerve, huh?
well, I'm thinking about all of the things that Jesus says. This is just one thing that Jesus says. There's other places where he like does woe to the Pharisees. We've talked about that in our podcast before. And I would say are Pharisees are pastors. That's how people would have seen them
Yeah.
in that time period. Pharisees are pastors who are pastoring badly. And Jesus has not all Pharisees are pastoring badly also. Like there are some Pharisees pastoring badly, and Jesus does not hold back from talking to those Pharisees about how they are pastoring.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a place for that. And there is a place for this, to say there is something else that he's saying here to his disciples, which is different. This is a group of people who followed him. What is he saying to them at this stage in time that is helpful for all of us? But we don't have to think that this is the only thing Jesus ever said. He has said some things about being divisive, about standing up for people. And in this one, he's talking about abiding. And in the whole, where is that going? Lisa, you were going to say something before. I said something.
No, well, I feel like, what if like the first verse, it's like Jesus just clarifying that this is what a vine keeper does. Like, it's not saying that God's doing all the, like, maybe this is just, like, what if it's just the preamble to, like, this is what a vine keeper does? I don't know. It really does feel like it's all connected. So I really feel like I'm really trying to make this a story of people not being cut off as branches. Which I don't know if I'm supposed to try that hard. That's part of it, is like this dance for me of like, well, and then, so then I'm trying to figure out a different way to hold it. Like, I don't necessarily need to undo what it's saying, because there's complicated things all over the Bible. I don't need to take everything as like my thing. But then if what I'm thinking about is like, if I want to identify as a disciple, then what the thing is for me to do is to figure out, like, what does that abiding like mean? What is that? What does it look like, especially now when Jesus is not here? Like, I get, like, in some ways I can picture, like, you know, the disciples that are there listening to it. Does that mean that they have to stay super close? Like, how do you abide in someone as they are moving all across the country, in like itinerantly teaching? How do I stay a part of that? Because in some ways, what Jesus has said is like, you've heard what I've spoke, you've heard all my preaching. You're pruned. Like, you've already been pruned just by listening. So then what does it mean then to abide? Like, is that about proximity? Does it mean that I look the same? Like, do all the grapes look the same on a vine? Or is there potential for different? I don't know. Like, I'm trying to like loosen up without trying to make it make sense, because every time I get into it, then I'm like, oh, nope, I think he's still cutting off people. And like, I've tried to look at, like, are they really being thrown into a fire? Are they making a fire? Is there other words? And like, that balo is such a funky Greek word that's like, it is to like cast, but it's also like to throw, and you don't care where it lands, which feels very much like not the same message of like, God cares for the birds. So like, why he would care for you?
Oh, that's
but
where I
also
still
God
don't.
doesn't. Sorry, go ahead, Steph.
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I don't think so. Like, yes, God cares for us and the birds and all that, but like, God doesn't. If my theology is that God doesn't overwhelm us to the point of like we no longer have agency. And so if sometimes it's helpful for me to read like, okay, what's the natural consequence of going down this path? And if you're gonna operate with a lack of fruit, right? Because you're divisive, you're greedy, you're marginalizing, you're casting out left and right, you're being the judgmental one, like you're probably not going to come to my community and be a part of my church because you're just going to get really uncomfortable every time I preach. And you're going to get really uncomfortable every time we go down to St. Paul and do a food ministry, or, like you're just going to get uncomfortable because we're just not going to talk like that. We're not going to, that's not how we're modeling our lives. Like, I would imagine that you're going to just you're going to go over there. I don't know where there is, but you might just find yourself not here.
You're going to go there.
You're going to go there and do it with there. Like, and that's not to say that we wouldn't want you to be here. We do, but like, we're just not going to talk that way about people, and we're not going to treat people that way. We're not going to be that selfish. Like, we're just not, and when we are, where we want to like know it, like resolve the blind spot, be aware of it, course correct. But I think there's some natural consequences to like within this passage a little bit, maybe.
So this might be too rose-colored of a reading, but I've got to give me a moment here. Critique and wrestle with what I'm about to say afterwards. Ready? Okay. So there's an emphasis in the first 5 verses about like choose to abide in me. I'm the branch. All you have to do to bear fruit is abide in me. So the verb there is meno, so remain, abide, sojourn. So that can be like walk with me, walk the way that I have walked.
Yeah.
Tarry. I say that one just because that's in the hymns. Like those who tarry till they're better will never come at all. So tarry with me, remain with me. So there's energy to do that. Then when we get to verse 5, those who haven't been doing that die. That's the first thing. That the first thing is they like fall off or die. Like that cast off isn't necessarily like a thrown off. It's just that like it's sort of that's the natural. You have chosen not to abide. That means if we are a vine, if you choose not to be connected to the vine, your branch is going to die because you haven't stayed connected to the source of your life. So once you have made that choice to not be connected, then the natural thing that's going to happen is that your branch will die. And then the natural thing that happens is the vine dresser comes and puts you in the fire to be burned because you've died. But if we don't assume that fire is hell or eternal cutoff, what we can then say is the fire the harder way to be pruned? Because in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew scriptures, we see fire as the way back to the garden. So are we assuming that fire is like death to that branch? Or are we assuming like Jesus could be saying to people, all right, you got a couple paths. Either you remain in me and you keep bearing fruit, or if you don't remain in me and you stop bearing fruit, then the vine keeper is going to throw you in the fire, and you're going to have to find your way to be pruned through the fire. Think about refiner's fire language. What if that's not the end? What if that's the path you have chosen is the harder path to be refined? Choose to bear fruit through staying connected to the vine, or you're going to have to take this harder path of going through the fire.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't say this is hell. It doesn't say this is forever. And other places in scripture, fire is not a forever thing. It is a refining thing, especially in the Hebrew scriptures. Thoughts?
I want to hear what Lisa has to say, because I have a feeling you're going to be a little bit more skeptical than I am.
Well, I think I'm exhausted with life right now. And so like the idea that this is a message for me is like, nope, I don't need shit cut off. Thank you. I'm good. I am tired. I don't need the fire to get my way back in. I don't want to be, no, because like that tension then is like, well, I know some people who should go through some fire, right? Like there's right? Like it's this tension of like, I don't really want it for me. I kind of want it for other people. And like trying to like figure out like, where am I in this? Like,
Mhm.
can I make space for like, I don't know. It feels so dangerous to think, oh, I've got it. So
Mm.
I'm good. I know I got good fruit. I do. Like, I can show everybody my fruit. Like, God, like that does not feel like the right energy of it. But like that is like it drills up all these like emotions of like,
Yeah.
it doesn't feel comforting. And I don't know that Jesus is supposed to always feel comforting, but sometimes when everything feels exhausting, what you want is the message of like, it's all good.
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
fine. But like, how would I actually know if I'm abiding in Jesus? Because I actually like when we sit down and read passages like this, I'm like, well, that's dicey. I don't know
Mhm.
anybody who really feels like they figured it out.
Mhm.
Because even people who have felt like resonant of Jesus, turns out they're just humans too. So like, I don't know. Like, what is that? What do you do with that?
Mhm.
Mhm.
Mm.
Jason, how do you feel about the optimistic view there that the fire is not the end, it's another way to be pruned and refined?
Um, I like it because I was instantly trying to like, okay, how do I place that in my life? And this is gonna sound so like, how awesome am I or whatever, or my community. But I could imagine somebody who comes to like a community like the one we're trying to be and is like, wow, this is really woo woo happy. Everybody's like trying to be all kind and bullshit. And they'd be like, this isn't for me. And they leave. And then something tragic happens in their life. And they're like, what do I do now? And wanting to be a place where that person could still feel like they could land and be like, and to be able to say, like, I hate that you had to go through what you've gone through, but like, but know that we're still here. And like, that sounds to me like the fire. Like they had to leave and the crap hit the fan. And now they're like, it's that whole idea of like the two paths of spiritual growth, of great suffering and great love. They didn't choose great abiding. They went a different path, and now great suffering is going to be a cold teacher. But I anyway. But I think to Lisa's point about like, yeah, not like I don't need to go through the pruning. I don't want to go through the fire, but I also don't want to have the arrogance to think that my fruit is like the greatest tasting grapes ever. Is
Mhm.
like a really weird tension to sit in the midst of this passage. It's almost like a lose lose lose, you know?
Mm.
Either you're burned, you're pruned, or you're an arrogant asshole. And it's like, which one? Sorry, I've already used enough choice language that we're gonna have to put an E next to this episode. I'm just decided to keep going.
I think that's the quote I'm gonna need to put on the social medias. You're either pruned or bruned or you're an arrogant asshole.
I think
Okay,
we would
what
get
is
some
interesting? Okay,
clicks.
so I did dive a little bit into the burn, like the burning, and it's not used a ton in the Gospels. It's actually very specifically used in the Gospels, where a lot of times it's actually likened to a lamp burning.
Hmm.
Like, so not like I don't know, like feels like different than the all-consuming fire. That it feels like, I don't know. I'm just trying to figure out like what is it?
Yeah.
I think we
Yeah,
have
I don't know.
learned. I think that's part of the unpacking to do in passages like this is to say we have heard so many damaging messages on hell and this place of eternal torment and fire that we automatically assume, I think, that
Mhm.
anytime fire is talked about in the New Testament, that's what it's talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And what if that's not what it's always talking about? Is like Jesus is saying there's a fire. There's lots of reasons I mean, I can think of lots of reasons in my own life why there are fires. I've got fires in my fireplace. I'll do fires in my backyard. Maybe you do a bonfire to burn up um,
Leaves.
leaves. Like, there's lots of reasons to have a fire. So part of the shakeup is just to say, let's
Most of them are not to shame a bunch of teens into, the sinner's prayer, right?
right. So let's just give Jesus the benefit of the doubt for a moment to say, what if this isn't some sort of eternal fire? This is just a fire. It's a fire.
Yeah.
What happens in a fire?
It's so funny. It reminds me, and this is so stupid and unrelated, but I think it's still kind of funny. There was a little meme that was going around. I'm not usually on social media, but it was a little girl. And the caption was, bro, don't think it's that big a deal. This girl, and she's pointing at her name, and it's Kate. And the mom goes, honey, what are you seeing? And she goes, it's the cross where Jesus died. And like the little brother goes, it's a T. Like, she's just drawing all these big conclusions about what this T in her name means. And he's like, it's a T. Like, let's just move on. I'm not trying to say the fire is like just a T, but like maybe it's not like the end all be all that we make it out.
Maybe it's just a fire.
Maybe it's a fire.
I also think I still am going to choose my own interpretation here, whether or not you guys choose it or other people agree that it matters that this isn't anthropos, because then I can think about parts of me being burned that need to be burned, which is not the whole of me nor the whole of someone else. That also makes the fire feel different and the vine feel different. If I think about it as this process of transformation and following, where I'll try to abide. Sometimes I do that better than others. Sometimes my fruit will be better than others. And that might mean that sometimes some part of me that's not abiding dies and God's got to burn it, which is also for my good. I don't know. There's a way then, like my job is just to keep trying to abide. That's it. That's my job. That's our job. All of our jobs is just to keep trying to abide. And to trust God with the rest. Now, whether or not I do a good job of trusting God with the rest is the other question. Because sometimes I'm like, is God actually gardening? Because maybe that's also another bad part, a hard part about this passage is it feels like nothing gets pruned that should be pruned.
That is a great point. I don't know how to have that conversation in the last like 5 minutes of this recording, but this is kind of the point I was getting at earlier, where if we're supposed to just trust God to be doing all the pruning and all the removing and whatever, the last 2,000 years of Christian history would potentially paint a different picture that's what's been happening. We talk about some of the things that go on right now with the name of Christianity in America and how it doesn't feel representative of Christ, but it doesn't really even hold water to
Crusades.
Like the Crusades or the Spanish Inquisition or something. We're talking about mass killings of people all in the name of Christ. Genocidal stuff, like that. Where was the pruning and where was the branches falling off there? We could have used a few branches falling off in those moments. What?
That made my brain immediately was like, whoa, I got some branches. Yep. Like, like all of a sudden you're like, oh, that would have changed the course of history.
Right.
I've got to prune those branches off.
Yeah.
Right.
Like it feels like good, and it feels like it can be helpful imagery in some sense, but also it feels all like that's not the lived experience of a lot of it. I was trying to think about I was thinking about my grapes because I was like, I'm really struggling with this. Like, if there's one vine, which is what this feels like, then, I don't know. I just like, it feels like the point of the fruit is that it is good for others, not necessarily for yourself. And a lot of our conversation is about what's good for ourselves. And the thing with the fruit is like, is it good for somebody else? And yeah, if it's not good for all, then maybe it does need to be destroyed. I don't know. I don't like thinking about that in terms of humans, but I
Mhm.
do think that we have a responsibility to look towards how do we support each other and care for each other, and is my whatever that fruit is that we're producing good for anyone to consume?
Mm,
Mhm. That feels like it connects back to Isaiah 58 in this series where we talked about our souls being like a well-watered garden, which if you
mhm,
um, and that part of what's happening there is not only are we then um, satisfied, like we're a well-watered garden, a spring of water whose waters fail not, but then the verse after that is then you shall be the builder of old waste places. You shall raise up the foundations of the generations and be called repairer of the breach, restorers of the path. That there's an energy of the healing that comes is for something. It's for others. It's for, and there's a similar energy here of what's the fruit. You're not just
mhm,
abiding in Jesus to feel good.
mhm,
It's in order to bear fruit. It's in order to repair the world.
mhm,
And so then it feels like, yeah, I think we want people who are abiding, and we want a God who is pruning so that the world is repaired and restored. And maybe that makes us more willing to engage in the difficult process of that
mhm.
if it's about the
Well,
fruit for the world.
and I think I wanna be really careful too that, like, it doesn't seem like in this passage God is the one removing the branches that are not bearing fruit. It it could be that they're more naturally not finding themselves attached to the vine anymore, and that God is the one doing the pruning of the fruit-bearing branches, which is very different than God being the one to say, "I'm gonna go around and just lop off all these dead branches." But what if we're looking at human history, just because the imagery in this passage is that all the dead branches get gathered up and put in a fire, I mean, fires can consume a lot of good stuff, right? Like fires can be what destroy homes. Like, I mean, so like when we talk about fire imagery, fires are powerful, and they draw attention. And so maybe there's a imagery here of like some of the stuff that isn't in alignment with the vine and has fallen away. Yeah, it's going to be a fire because it's going to rage and it's going to get attention and it's going to destroy some stuff. And yet abiding in Christ, bearing fruit, being open to pruning will persist. It will keep going. It won't stop, even if the fires rage. Like, this will keep going. And it might not be the dominant voice in culture, it might not be the dominant voice of history, but it'll still be there. And that's the hope of abiding in Christ, is that it will still keep going. This has been a 40 Orchards podcast. At 40 Orchards, our mission is to create circles for all people to wrestle through biblical text so that together we can expand each other's experience of what is sacred, whole, and good. We search through the lens of sacred possibility, assuming there is more to be discovered, questioned, and applied as we listen for how God is still speaking. You can learn more about 40 Orchards and sign up for a study by going to 40, that's 40orchards.org. Our opening music is by LesFM. Our closing music is by NCR Music Vibes. Additional music is by 3 Music. Any references to books or other sources can be found in the show notes of this episode. Thank you for searching the sacred.